Philadelphia, on a bitterly cold winter afternoon. The sky was an ominous shade of gray, hinting an impending tragedy. A gentle drizzle blurred the windows of Dr. Jacob Harris's private clinic, a place respected by the local community for his dedication and exceptional medical skills. Yet no one could have guessed that behind his friendly smile, compassionate eyes, and hands known for saving lives, lurked a dark, terrifying secret, waiting patiently to erupt. As night fell, horrifying secrets were concealed deeper into darkness, hidden away until one victim finally dared to speak, but by then, it might already be too late. Dr. Jacob Harris, a 42-year-old white physician, was viewed as an ideal doctor in Philadelphia. He was renowned for his warmth, dedication, and particular care for the health of the Black community in the impoverished neighborhoods surrounding his clinic. To the locals, Jacob symbolized compassion and kindness. But the truth was never as simple as it appeared. Jacob carried a dark secret. More than a year ago, he discovered he had contracted HIV after an unprotected sexual encounter with an unknown woman during a medical conference in Chicago. Instead of facing reality, Jacob decided to hide his condition to protect the reputation and status he had meticulously built over many years. His life might have remained safely concealed behind lies if it weren't for the arrival of Keisha Thompson, a 30-year-old Black woman who regularly visited his clinic for health checkups. Keisha was attractive, a single mother living in loneliness since her husband's death several years earlier. Jacob quickly took advantage of her vulnerability, engaging in a secret romantic relationship with her. One afternoon in late November, Keisha started experiencing troubling symptoms: prolonged high fevers, muscle pain, and chronic fatigue. After several medical tests, she was diagnosed as HIV positive. Keisha's world collapsed in an instant. She immediately realized the only possible source of infection was the man she trusted most, Jacob Harris. Determined to confront him, she invited Jacob to her modest apartment to get to the bottom of everything. The meeting quickly escalated into tension. Keisha, consumed by rage, repeatedly accused Jacob. Dr. Harris initially denied everything, but when Keisha threatened to expose him publicly and report him to the authorities, Jacob completely lost control. In that blind moment of panic, Jacob strangled Keisha until she stopped breathing. When he finally calmed down, staring at her lifeless body, he realized he had reached the point of no return. Jacob decided to stage the scene to look like an accident, hoping to cover up his horrifying crime. The next morning, police found Keisha's body. Everyone assumed it was a tragic accident, except for Detective Marcus Powell, who began raising doubts about the sudden death of this young woman. From this moment forward, deadly secrets slowly began to unravel. After the death of Keisha Thompson, everything seemed to return to normal at Jacob Harris's small clinic. He resumed his daily routine, greeting patients with his usual polite smile, answering health consultation calls, and even attending local medical seminars as a respected doctor. Yet beneath this flawless facade, Jacob lived in constant anxiety, haunted nightly by visions of Keisha's pale, lifeless face. Still, he chose not to stop. He kept his HIV-positive status a secret and continued engaging in risky affairs with his female patients, as if it was the only way to escape his overwhelming guilt and fear. 2 months later, another young woman entered Jacob's life. Mia Edwards, a 26-year-old Black nurse who had recently started working at the community hospital near Jacob's clinic. Mia immediately captured Jacob's attention with her charm, confidence, and striking beauty. It wasn't long before Mia became a regular patient of Jacob's clinic, seeking his medical advice on personal health matters. Jacob quickly won Mia over with his elegant appearance and deceptive care. Soon, their relationship crossed the boundary of doctor-patient into a secret, passionate, yet dangerously reckless affair. Mia remained completely unaware of the dark past hidden behind the man she trusted wholeheartedly. One afternoon in March, Mia arrived for a follow-up appointment, visibly exhausted and anxious. The test results she received plunged her into despair. She too had contracted HIV. Unlike Keisha before her, Mia was strong-willed and fiercely outspoken. She immediately confronted Jacob right there in his clinic. "You knew you were sick, didn't you?" Mia shouted, her eyes burning with anger and hurt. "You intentionally infected me." Jacob tried desperately to remain calm, his voice trembling as he offered the same old lies and excuses. But Mia refused to believe him. She threatened to report Jacob to the hospital authorities, the police, and even expose him publicly through the media. Jacob realized he was facing the real possibility of losing everything, this time far more devastating than before. Later that night, as Mia returned home, Jacob silently followed her. In the darkness, the respected doctor had transformed into a trembling figure, sweating coldly, gripping a small knife in his hand. He knew he couldn't allow Mia to survive and expose the truth. But what Jacob hadn't anticipated was that, just as he prepared to attack, a beam of headlights from a police cruiser suddenly illuminated the darkened street. Detective Marcus Powell, who never forgot the suspicious, accidental death of Keisha Thompson, had been quietly tracking Dr. Jacob Harris for several weeks. Now Powell sat in his vehicle, watching carefully with sharp, unyielding eyes as Jacob Harris narrowly avoided committing another horrifying crime. Powell knew then, this case was far from over. The sudden flash of the police headlights jolted Jacob's mind like an alarm bell. His heart raced so loudly he could almost hear it echoing through the darkness. He hastily slipped the knife into his coat pocket, backing silently into the shadows of a nearby alley, eyes fixed nervously on the police cruiser pulling up to the street corner. Detective Marcus Powell, bundled in his heavy coat, stepped out of the vehicle, his sharp eyes scanning the deserted street. Though he hadn't directly witnessed Jacob's intended crime, Powell was certain he'd arrived just in time to prevent another tragedy. He swiftly approached Mia, who was trembling near the entrance to her apartment. "Are you all right?" Powell asked gently, his eyes filled with concern. Mia shook her head slowly, her voice still quivering. Fine, but I think someone was following me." "Was it Dr. Jacob Harris?" Powell asked directly, his tone serious. Mia hesitated briefly, then nodded slowly as tears streamed down her face. Only now did she realize just how narrowly she had escaped death. Detective Powell escorted Mia safely into her apartment and stayed with her throughout the evening, carefully listening as she recounted everything, from her secret relationship with Jacob, her HIV diagnosis, and the threats she'd received from the highly respected doctor. Powell understood it was time to take decisive action to stop this dangerous criminal. Meanwhile, Jacob returned home, overwhelmed by panic. The situation was painfully clear. He was now firmly in the sights of the police. Cold sweat drenched his back as memories flooded him. The death of Keisha, and now his failed attempt to silence Mia. Jacob knew he needed a definitive solution. He had no choice but to ensure Mia's silence permanently, before Detective Powell could gather enough evidence. 2 nights later, late in the evening, Jacob quietly returned to Mia's apartment, this time fully prepared. He knocked on her door calmly, pretending nothing was wrong. When Mia opened the door, her expression turned instantly fearful and defiant. "What are you doing here?" Mia snapped, trying to slam the door shut. But Jacob was faster. He shoved the door open with his shoulder, stepping swiftly inside. A fierce struggle erupted immediately in the narrow hallway. Mia fought back desperately, screaming for help, but Jacob muffled her cries. In a blind rage, he shoved her violently toward the stairs. Mia tumbled down the steps, each thud echoing grimly in the silent night. Jacob stood at the top of the staircase, breathing heavily, staring down at Mia's motionless body lying at the bottom. A cold sensation filled his chest as he quickly arranged the scene, staging it as if Mia had accidentally slipped while rushing down the stairs. For the second time, Jacob Harris fled the scene with blood-stained hands, believing he had once again escaped the consequences of his terrible act. But this time, he'd unknowingly left behind crucial evidence, and Detective Marcus Powell was determined not to let another innocent life be lost in vain. When police arrived early the next morning, Powell stood silently before Mia's body, his eyes filled with grim determination. This time, he vowed, Jacob Harris wouldn't slip through the cracks of justice again. The dim light from Mia's apartment spilled into the hallway as Philadelphia police began securing the crime scene. Detective Marcus Powell stood quietly, his eyes carefully observing every small detail around Mia's lifeless body. At first glance, her death appeared to be an ordinary accident, but Powell instinctively sensed there was something deeply wrong here. He had enough experience to distinguish between accidental falls and carefully staged murders. The bruises and abrasions on Mia's arms didn't match a simple slip and fall scenario. Powell immediately felt sure that Dr. Jacob Harris was the prime suspect. After the forensic team finished their work, Powell returned to the police station, deep in thought about the string of incidents involving Jacob. He reopened the file on Keisha Thompson's suspicious accident several months earlier. Both victims were young black women. Both were Jacob's patients, and both died under mysteriously ambiguous circumstances. The door to Powell's office swung open as Sergeant Lucas Williams walked in, holding a thick file. "Here's Mia Edwards' medical report, sir," Lucas said. "She recently tested HIV positive, just like Keisha Thompson before her." Powell's eyes flashed coldly, and the common factor between them is Dr. Jacob Harris. Powell knew he had to act swiftly. However, directly confronting a doctor as respected as Jacob wasn't going to be easy. Jacob was admired in the community, and any accusations lacking solid proof could backfire against Powell himself. A few days later, Powell arranged a private meeting with Jacob at his clinic. Their conversation began with deceptive civility. "Dr. Harris," Powell began calmly, but with a penetrating gaze, "what exactly was your relationship with Mia Edwards and Keisha Thompson?" Jacob feigned surprise, though his eyes betrayed anxiety. "They were my patients, nothing more." Powell smiled slightly. "Interesting, isn't it? Both your young female patients were HIV positive before dying mysteriously." Jacob stood abruptly, tension evident in his voice. "Exactly what are you suggesting, detective? I've always adhered strictly to my professional ethics." Powell remained seated, his gaze unwavering. "You might fool everyone else, Dr. Harris, but not me. We'll be seeing each other again soon." After Powell left, Jacob stood motionless for a long moment, heart pounding with fear and anger. He knew Detective Powell wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. But Jacob was determined not to be taken down easily. A ruthless plan started forming in his mind, this time targeting Detective Marcus Powell himself. Meanwhile, Powell had already decided to closely monitor Jacob Harris in secret. He was certain that, left unchecked, a deranged killer like Jacob would strike again. Powell vowed silently that this time, he would ensure that the doctor's horrific spree was stopped before he could claim another victim. After the tense confrontation with Detective Marcus Powell, Jacob Harris sank deeper into paranoia and fear. He began doubting everything around him. Even accidental glances from patients or faint footsteps passing by his clinic startled him. Yet this constant anxiety could not suppress the predatory instinct still simmering inside him. Jacob decided he needed to quickly find another target, as though it were the only way to silence his overwhelming fear. This time, his victim was Simone Carter, a 32-year-old black woman working as a communications specialist for a major local company. Simone had first come to Jacob's clinic a few months earlier for a routine checkup. From their first encounter, Jacob had been captivated by her striking beauty and self-confidence. Jacob knew he was gambling with fate, but strangely, the danger made him feel even more exhilarated. Exploiting Simone's trust and good faith, he invited her to dinner, claiming he wanted to discuss her health in more detail. Simone agreed, completely unaware of the hidden danger. During dinner at a quiet suburban restaurant, Jacob maintained his facade of kindness and charm, fully hiding his true intentions. Simone gradually became captivated by his seemingly trustworthy demeanor, completely unaware that Jacob was quietly setting her up for a deadly fate. But this time, Jacob underestimated Detective Marcus Powell's vigilance. Powell had never stopped quietly monitoring Jacob from a distance, meticulously tracking every move. When Powell learned Jacob was meeting Simone, he decided to act immediately. After dinner that evening, Jacob brought Simone back to his apartment, intending to carry out his familiar plan, to spread his deadly disease and silence the victim if necessary. But to his surprise, when Jacob opened the door, Powell and his police team were already inside, guns pointed directly at him. "Dr. Jacob Harris," Powell announced coldly, "you're under arrest on suspicion of involvement in the deaths of Keisha Thompson and Mia Edwards." Jacob stood frozen, his face pale with horror. Simone staggered back in shock, unable to believe what she was hearing. "What are you talking about? There must be some mistake." Jacob tried to remain calm, but the trembling in his voice betrayed everything. Powell stepped closer, his eyes fixed steadily on Jacob. "The evidence is clear, doctor. We found your DNA under Mia Edwards' fingernails, enough to prove you murdered her. We also know you've concealed your HIV status, intentionally infecting innocent black women who trusted you as their doctor." Jacob was speechless. Powell's words struck deep, shattering the carefully crafted image he'd maintained for years. Police officers handcuffed Jacob and let him out of the apartment as Simone watched in horror and disbelief. As the police car pulled away, Powell stood watching silently from afar, feeling both relief and sadness. But he knew the case was far from closed. A dangerous criminal like Jacob Harris would never easily admit his crimes. The battle for justice had truly just begun. Jacob Harris sat silently in the cold interrogation room at the Philadelphia Police Department. Harsh white neon lights shone down, illuminating his pale, tense face. Across from him sat Detective Marcus Powell, calmly observing every subtle gesture of the once respected doctor. "You know, Dr. Harris," Powell slowly broke the tense silence. "The evidence this time is clearer than you might think. I strongly advise you to confess now." Jacob forced a bitter smile, his eyes cold and defiant. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm innocent. What happened to Mia and Keisha were tragic accidents." Powell quietly opened a file in front of Jacob, gently pushing it toward him. Inside were detailed crime scene photographs and forensic evidence reports, particularly a close-up photo of blood beneath Mia's fingernails. Seeing this, Jacob flinched involuntarily, his face turning deathly pale. "The blood beneath Mia's fingernails is an exact DNA match to yours," Powell said firmly. "We also found small traces of blood inside the apartment you previously rented to meet with Mia. Even though you tried cleaning it thoroughly, modern technology still revealed those hidden stains. How do you plan on explaining that?" Jacob remained silent, lips trembling without forming a word. For the first time, he realized Powell had truly trapped him. This evidence was too damning. His familiar lies would no longer help him escape. However, Jacob's arrogance and pride still prevented him from admitting guilt. He drew a sharp breath, attempting to regain his fake confidence. "Maybe I was there. Mia was my patient. She came to me for medical advice. A few drops of blood mean nothing. It certainly doesn't prove that I murdered her." Powell leaned forward, his gaze becoming colder, sharper. "You're good at manipulating people, Dr. Harris. But not this time. We also have another witness." Jacob visibly startled. Powell knew he had delivered a strong, psychological blow to Jacob's confidence. "What witness?" Jacob asked quietly, his voice betraying a tremor despite his attempt to remain calm. "Simone Carter," Powell answered decisively. "She detailed your plans for that evening, and now she's ready to testify against you in court." Jacob felt as if his heart had stopped. He had never imagined Simone would prove to be so strong and decisive. In an instant, everything around him seemed to collapse entirely. Jacob lowered his head, for the first time unable to find any further excuses. Powell stood up, signaling an officer waiting outside the door to escort Jacob back to his cell. Before leaving, Powell turned to Jacob one last time, his voice firm with determination. "Your crimes are over, Harris. You'll finally pay the price for what you've done." The door closed behind Powell, leaving Jacob alone in the cold interrogation room. He sat motionless, staring blankly into empty space, finally understanding that there was no escaping justice this time. Yet, deep within his twisted and darkened mind, Jacob still nurtured one last desperate idea, a dangerous plan to reverse his fate, despite knowing this final gamble could cost him everything, even his own life. The cramped days in his jail cell drove Jacob Harris deeper into desperation and madness. Accustomed to a life of comfort and privilege, being trapped within four cold, lonely walls nearly pushed him to the brink. Yet, Jacob clung fiercely to one last faint hope, reversing his fate by leveraging what remained of his reputation. Jacob knew he couldn't outright deny the forensic evidence Detective Powell had presented. However, he could still plant seeds of doubt in the jury's minds. He planned to exploit his former connections, hire the best lawyers money could buy, and manipulate the media to spin his case into a narrative about an honorable doctor wrongfully accused. At the preliminary hearing held weeks later, Jacob appeared publicly wearing an elegant suit, a sorrowful expression, and spoke with convincing sincerity. His attorney masterfully twisted the story, arguing that the police had deliberately fabricated evidence against a renowned white doctor trusted by the black community, attempting to calm public outrage over racial tensions in Philadelphia. This narrative partially succeeded. Public opinion quickly divided. Some began believing Jacob was a victim of a political scheme intended to enhance the Philadelphia police's image. Others remained convinced that he was a dangerous serial killer attempting to escape justice. Detective Powell sat quietly in the courtroom gallery, watching the elaborate performance Jacob and his lawyer had staged. He felt frustration and helplessness as the cold-blooded doctor again manipulated the truth, turning the victims into aggressors and himself into the victim. After days of intense courtroom battles, the hearing ended in high tension. When the jury announced they couldn't reach a unanimous verdict, Jacob smiled subtly in arrogant relief. The trial concluded in a hung jury, forcing a retrial at a later date. Afterward, Powell met with Simone Carter, the prosecution's key witness. Simone was distraught, fearful, and confused upon learning Jacob had not yet been convicted. "Will he get away with this, detective?" Simone asked nervously. Powell looked at her firmly, his voice confident. "I won't let that happen, Simone. I promise you, Jacob Harris will face justice. He won't escape again." But Powell knew he had to find even stronger evidence, undeniable proof, sharper than any weapon, to cut through Jacob Harris's web of lies. He swore to himself that, no matter what it took, he would uncover that evidence. After the mistrial, Jacob Harris was quickly released on bail, thanks to a massive amount of money put up by wealthy friends who still believed in his innocence. Jacob walked out of jail with a smug look, openly challenging the outraged gaze of Detective Marcus Powell, who stood quietly observing from a distant corner. Powell knew there was no room for mistakes this time. Deep inside him, a powerful instinct whispered that the key to finally convicting Jacob lay hidden in the past, specifically in the truths held by victims Jacob thought he'd silence forever. Immediately after Jacob's release, Powell dove deeper into the life of Keisha Thompson, Jacob's first victim. He visited Keisha's sister, Linda Thompson, who lived on the outskirts of Philadelphia. Sitting in Linda's small living room, surrounded by photos of Keisha, Powell listened carefully as Linda tearfully spoke. "Keisha kept a diary, Detective," Linda said softly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Maybe what you need is in there." Linda approached a small drawer near Keisha's bed and took out a brown leather-bound notebook. Powell carefully accepted the diary, slowly turning its slightly yellowed pages filled with Keisha's trembling handwriting. He read every word, anger and sorrow rising within him as Keisha's detailed accounts came vividly to life. Keisha had carefully described her dangerous relationship with Jacob, her suspicions about contracting HIV from him, and Jacob's subtle threats if she dared reveal their secret. The final entry made Powell shiver. "If anything happens to me, Jacob Harris is responsible." I only pray someone finds this diary and makes him pay for what he's done. Powell sat frozen for a moment, feeling as if Keisha herself had returned from the grave to deliver this urgent message. With this new evidence, Powell knew he held the critical key that would finally dismantle Jacob Harris's web of lies. Meanwhile, Jacob lived his temporary freedom with anxiety and paranoia. He knew Powell would never give up, and the relentless detective would stop at nothing to return him to jail. Jacob began seriously considering leaving the city, even fleeing the country if necessary. But he was also painfully aware of the police surveillance watching his every move. Every night, Jacob suffered through endless nightmares, haunted by the whispers of Keisha and Mia echoing coldly in his ears. Then, early one morning, there came an unexpected knock at his door. Jacob's heart raced wildly as he opened it, only to find Powell standing before him, holding that familiar diary. The silent witness had finally spoken. "Mr. Harris," Powell stated coldly, his voice powerful with conviction. "We've uncovered something you can't deny. The time has come for you to pay for your crimes." Jacob stood frozen, staring at the diary, as if seeing Keisha's ghost returning to exact vengeance. For the first time, true fear overwhelmed him, because Jacob now knew with absolute certainty that this time there was no escaping justice. Keisha's diary opened a dark new chapter in a case previously mired in uncertainty. Jacob Harris, who had always relied on his talent for manipulation, was now confronted by undeniable truth. That diary, the delicate handwriting of the woman he'd murdered, had become a powerful and irrefutable piece of evidence against him. The second trial soon began amid tense anticipation from the media and the public. Detective Marcus Powell sat beside the prosecutor, calm-faced but with determination burning in his eyes. He knew this was the last, best chance to finally deliver justice against Jacob Harris. Jacob appeared in court once again in his elegant suit, but this time without his previous arrogance. His eyes were filled with fear, continuously avoiding the piercing gazes from the jury and the victims' families. Simone Carter stepped onto the witness stand first. Her voice trembled but remained strong as she recounted how Jacob had seduced and manipulated her into a deadly trap. After Simone's compelling testimony, the prosecutor presented Keisha's diary to the courtroom. A heavy silence fell as Keisha's final words were read aloud to the jury. "If anything happens to me, Jacob Harris is responsible." The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Every gaze turned toward Jacob, who sat with his head bowed, his hands shaking in fear and despair. He knew he'd been completely defeated by the accusations of a dead woman. The prosecutor turned to the jury and spoke clearly. Jacob Harris didn't just murder. He abused his position as a doctor to intentionally infect innocent black women with HIV, and then killed them ruthlessly when his crimes risked exposure. Jacob's lawyer made weak attempts at rebuttal, but no one was fooled anymore by empty excuses. After 3 tense days of deliberations, the jury found Jacob Harris guilty of first-degree murder. A wave of relief swept through the courtroom. The victims' families wept quietly, overcome with relief and gratitude. Detective Powell exhaled deeply, glancing upward and whispering a silent thank you to Keisha, Mia, and the other victims. Jacob sat frozen, unable to comprehend the verdict. He slowly turned, casting a hateful yet utterly powerless gaze at Powell. The trial concluded with Jacob Harris being sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Guards led him away, his once dignified figure now reduced to a stumbling prisoner condemned to live out his days behind bars. Outside the courtroom, Powell met Simone Carter again. She stepped forward, shaking his hand. Her eyes were still damp, but they held a new strength. "Thank you, Detective," Simone said softly. "Because of you, women like Keisha and Mia finally have justice." Powell smiled gently, firmly gripping Simone's hand. "It's my duty, and it's the least I can do for courageous women like you and Keisha." Yet deep within his heart, Powell knew that despite the trial's conclusion, the shadow of Jacob Harris's crimes would haunt him forever. because some evils in this world can never truly be forgotten. Jacob Harris had begun his new life within the walls of a federal prison, held in solitary confinement to protect him from retaliation by other inmates. Every day, in his cramped cell, Jacob sank deeper into despair, haunted relentlessly by memories of his victims. His sleep was continually disturbed by icy whispers from his dark past. Outside the prison, Detective Marcus Powell still didn't feel entirely at ease. One day, he received unexpected news from a confidential informant. Jacob Harris was planning a prison escape, aided by a corrupt prison guard. Powell immediately launched an undercover investigation, secretly placing an informant within the prison to closely monitor Jacob and the suspected guard. Within a matter of weeks, Powell's informant gathered enough evidence confirming the daring escape plot. On a freezing night, just as Jacob and the guard were about to put their escape plan into motion, Powell and a special police unit ambushed them outside the prison security perimeter. Jacob collapsed to the ground, his face twisted in despair as he realized his final plan had failed. Powell stepped forward, looking down at Jacob coldly but calmly. "Give it up, Harris. Justice will never let you go." Jacob was escorted back to his cell, knowing this time there would be no further chances. Powell left the prison under the cloak of darkness, somewhat relieved, yet still haunted by a lingering question. Had this nightmare truly come to an end? To the failed prison escape, Jacob Harris was officially classified as a high-risk inmate. He was stripped entirely of any remaining freedoms and confined to a small, isolated cell where time seemed frozen. In this absolute solitude, Jacob descended further into paranoia, haunted constantly by the voices of his victims whispering endlessly in his ears. Meanwhile, Detective Marcus Powell still couldn't bring himself to fully close the case. Powell knew that Jacob had never completely confessed to all of his past crimes. There might be other victims police hadn't yet discovered. Determined, Powell devised a sophisticated psychological trap, hoping Jacob would unknowingly reveal hidden truths. One morning, Powell visited Jacob in the prison visitation room. Facing each other through bulletproof glass, Powell looked straight into Jacob's eyes and said, "I came to let you know we found another body, Jacob. Seems this time you weren't careful enough. There's solid evidence linking it directly to you." Jacob flinched, his face drained of color, panic evident in his eyes. "Impossible. I was always careful." Powell smiled coldly, knowing he was halfway to success. "We already identified the victim. Perhaps you prefer to give us her name yourself before we announce it publicly?" Jacob sat silently, his mind racing chaotically. He wasn't sure whether Powell truly found another victim or not, but fear and guilt rapidly overwhelmed him. After several tense minutes, he lowered his head, whispering almost inaudibly. "Her name was Alicia Brown. I never intended to kill her, but she discovered everything too soon." Powell sat quietly, masking his surprise and relief. In reality, they hadn't discovered another victim. This had been a carefully planned psychological bluff. Jacob had stepped into Powell's trap perfectly, inadvertently revealing another crime he believed safely buried forever. Powell stood up, looking calmly at Jacob one last time before leaving. "Thank you for your cooperation, Harris. Perhaps you'll sleep better now, knowing there are no more secrets to hide." Jacob remained seated, horrified by the realization that he had just given away his last hidden truth. Powell left the prison, his heart heavy yet somewhat relieved. He knew that no matter what it took, he would find Alicia Brown and finally deliver the justice she had long been denied. After Jacob's unexpected revelation about Alicia Brown, Detective Marcus Powell immediately assembled a team to investigate. They painstakingly searched through old records, carefully following every clue Jacob had inadvertently provided. After several days of relentless effort, investigators finally confirmed that Alicia Brown had indeed been Jacob's patient and had mysteriously disappeared nearly 2 years prior. Shortly afterward, Alicia's remains were discovered in a secluded wooded area just outside the city. This time, There was no escape for Jacob Harris. Forensic evidence collected at the scene strongly supported his earlier admission. When Powell returned to the prison to see Jacob again, he found him completely broken. Jacob sat motionless on the small bed, his eyes empty and staring blankly ahead. "I didn't expect you to come back," Jacob whispered weakly, his voice drained of any remaining strength. Powell stood just outside the cell bars, carefully observing Jacob's pale face. "I'm here because of Alicia Brown. Her family deserves to know the whole truth." Jacob lowered his head as tears of belated remorse slowly began to stream down his cheeks. In his ultimate moment of weakness, he gradually revealed the haunting details of Alicia's death. He confessed that he had killed Alicia after she discovered his HIV status too soon. He had carefully hidden her body, desperately hoping the truth would remain buried forever. Powell listened carefully, his heart weighed down heavily by the sorrow of these innocent victims. When Jacob finished his confession, he looked up at Powell, utterly hopeless. "You now have everything you wanted. Do I have anything left to lose?" Powell stared at him, eyes cold, yet bearing a faint trace of compassion. "You lost everything long ago, Harris. The only meaningful thing you can do now is confess completely, to let those you harmed finally rest in peace." Jacob nodded slowly, resigned to the fate he'd created for himself. As Powell walked away from the prison this time, he knew he was close to completing his journey toward justice. But deep inside, he remained burdened by the innocent lives that could never be restored. Several months had passed since Jacob fully confessed his crimes involving Alicia Brown, and his life in prison grew increasingly bleak. Jacob rapidly deteriorated. His body weakened, and his mind blurred constantly between past and present. Other prisoners often overheard him muttering incoherently about his victims, his voice filled with fear. Outside the prison walls, Detective Marcus Powell still couldn't completely let go. Even though the case was legally closed, Powell always sensed Jacob had withheld something important. One afternoon, Powell received an unexpected phone call from an anonymous woman claiming to be a former colleague of Jacob's at the clinic. She revealed that before his arrest, Jacob had confided to her that he wasn't the only person in the clinic aware of his intentionally infecting female black patients with HIV. There was another doctor, a close colleague, who had quietly concealed the truth to protect both their reputations. Following this lead, Powell secretly investigated and quickly identified Dr. Michael Jennings, a longtime associate of Jacob's. Jennings had publicly defended Jacob to the media when the crimes first emerged. Powell decided to confront Jennings directly. They met in a tense exchange at a quiet cafe. Initially, Jennings denied everything, but when Powell presented compelling evidence he'd quietly gathered, Jennings finally admitted the bitter truth. "Yes, I knew Jacob was HIV positive for a long time, but if I had revealed that, the clinic's reputation would have been destroyed. So I chose silence." Powell stared at Jennings, barely containing his anger and disgust. He responded coldly, "Your silence killed innocent people, Jennings. Now, you must also face justice." Following their conversation, Dr. Jennings was arrested and charged as an accomplice for covering up serious criminal acts. Powell felt both relief and heaviness, finally having exposed the entire web of deceit, yet knowing the consequences of these horrifying secrets would forever haunt him. The arrest of Dr. Michael Jennings sent yet another shockwave through the community. Jacob Harris's case was no longer merely the crime of a single individual. It had exposed an entire system of complicity and concealed truths. The public reeled, realizing how silence driven by personal interest could cost so many innocent lives. Meanwhile, Jacob continued deteriorating rapidly in prison. His weight plummeted, and his sunken eyes betrayed a profound loss of will to live. Haunted daily by horrific memories, Jacob's suffering became increasingly evident on his gaunt face. For Detective Marcus Powell, the investigation was not yet finished. He tirelessly continued looking for any other victims Jacob might have harmed or killed. Powell met again with the families of Alicia Brown, Keisha Thompson, Mia Edwards, and every other unfortunate woman affected, promising to do everything possible to bring complete justice to them. At a memorial ceremony held in downtown Philadelphia for Jacob's victims, Powell stood before the crowd, emotional yet determined. "We cannot bring back what was lost, but we will ensure these unjust deaths are never forgotten." Justice arrived late, but has finally been delivered. The victims' families embraced each other, deeply moved. Simone Carter stood by Powell's side, gripping his hand tightly in gratitude beyond words. Back in his prison cell, upon learning of the memorial, Jacob sat motionless on his small bed, staring blankly into empty space. He realized that he would never escape the ghosts of his past, nor would he ever have another chance at redemption. As the sun began to set, Powell left the memorial with a heavy yet strangely relieved heart. He knew he'd finally kept his promise to the victims, though the wounds left in his heart could never fully heal. The following years passed in heavy silence for Jacob Harris. He spent most of his time locked in the darkness of solitary confinement, tormented endlessly by ghosts from his past. Jacob aged rapidly, his mental state deteriorated severely, and eventually, he barely recognized himself. Detective Marcus Powell continued working at the Philadelphia Police Department, but Jacob Harris's case haunted him relentlessly, preventing him from ever forgetting the faces of the victims. Nonetheless, Powell found some peace as he watched the community slowly begin to heal, wounds that would never fully vanish, yet at least they were no longer bleeding. Years later, on a quiet winter afternoon, Powell received news that Jacob Harris had died in prison from complications of the HIV infection, the very disease he had intentionally spread to others. Powell received this news quietly, without relief or satisfaction. Instead, he felt only deep sadness for everything Jacob had done, for all the lives he had irrevocably destroyed. During a simple annual memorial ceremony held for Jacob's victims, Powell stood beside Simone Carter, both holding lit candles in remembrance. Simone spoke softly, her voice filled with emotion. "It's finally over now, isn't it, Detective?" Powell looked at her, his eyes slightly sorrowful yet warmer. "Yes, Simone. Although we can't change what happened, at least we've delivered justice for those we lost." When the ceremony ended, Powell slowly walked away, his footsteps quiet on the snow-covered sidewalk. He knew that even though the case had closed, the memories of Jacob Harris and his victims would stay with him forever, reminders to remain vigilant against deceit, silence, and injustice. Above Philadelphia, the snow continued to fall quietly, a gentle reminder that evil, in the end, always faces justice. Though sometimes delayed, it inevitably finds its way back.